The moment a man realizes he chose the wrong future is never loud. It's quiet, like a breath he forgot to take. The ballroom stretched wide under crystal chandeliers, each light refracting into 1,000 sharp glints across polished marble floors. The kind of place where power didn't just exist, it performed. And tonight, Ethan Cole stood at the center of it all, exactly where he had always wanted to be. Tailored black tuxedo, fitting his frame like precision engineering, voice measured, confident. Every word landing with the ease of a man who had spent years mastering not just business, but perception. The audience leaned in. Investors, media figures, executives with portfolios heavy enough to tilt industries. All eyes fixed on him as he spoke about expansion, innovation, the next phase of his company's dominance. And for a moment, everything aligned perfectly. The applause came on cue. The cameras captured his best angles. The narrative held, clean, controlled, flawless, just as he had designed it. But control has a limit, and it always breaks at the exact moment you least expect, because just as Ethan shifted his gaze across the room, scanning faces he recognized and names he had memorized, his eyes stopped, not gradually, not by curiosity, but like something inside him had been pulled tight without warning, because at the far end of the ballroom, near the edge where lights softened and shadows lingered, she walked in, and suddenly the air changed in a way no one could explain, not in words, not in logic. Just in the subtle way conversations paused a second too long and heads turned half a beat too late, as if the room itself needed time to understand what it was seeing. Amara Bennett didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She moved with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't need to arrive loudly to be noticed, her heels barely echoing against the marble, her posture steady, shoulders relaxed, every step deliberate. Like she had already walked through this moment in her mind 100 times and found no reason to fear it. And she wasn't alone, because beside her, a small hand rested in hers, fingers wrapped gently but securely, the kind of grip that didn't come from dependence, but from trust. And the child walked at her pace, calm, observant, not distracted by the noise, not overwhelmed by the space, just present, as if he belonged there without needing permission. Ethan didn't hear the applause fade, didn't notice the slight confusion ripple through the audience as his voice slowed, then stopped entirely, mid-sentence, the kind of pause that should have been filled immediately, but wasn't, because his mind had already left the stage, left the speech, left the version of himself he had spent years constructing, and returned, unwillingly, to a memory he had buried under success and headlines and carefully curated decisions. A memory that looked exactly like the woman now walking into his world as if it had never belonged to him in the first place. 5 years earlier, the room had been smaller, colder, the kind of private office where conversations weren't meant to be witnessed, where decisions were made in low voices and sealed with signatures, and Amara had stood near the window, her reflection faint against the glass, listening without interruption as Ethan explained, calmly, rationally, why their life together no longer aligned with where he was going. He had used words like trajectory, like image, like long-term positioning, terms that made sense in boardrooms but felt hollow in a moment that required something more human, something he chose not to give. And when he finally said it, when he looked at her and told her, "You don't fit the life I'm building," the silence that followed wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive. It was simple, heavy, complete, and she didn't cry, didn't raise her voice, didn't ask him to reconsider. She just nodded once, slow, controlled, like she understood something deeper than what he had just said. And in that understanding, something shifted permanently, because she didn't argue with his decision. She accepted it in a way that removed any power he thought he had over the outcome. And then she walked away, not in anger, not in defeat, but in quiet finality, leaving behind a space that felt emptier than he expected, though he never allowed himself to sit in that feeling long enough to name it. Back in the present, the ballroom continued to breathe around him, but Ethan felt disconnected from it, like the sound had been turned down on everything except the rhythm of his own thoughts. And as Amara moved further into the light, the details sharpened, the subtle confidence in the way she carried herself, the understated elegance of her dress, the way people who didn't yet know her still made space as she passed. instinctively recognizing something they couldn't quite define. And then there was the child, whose presence should have been secondary, but wasn't, because something about him pulled attention in a way that didn't rely on performance or effort, just existence. And when he tilted his head slightly, looking up at the vast ceiling before glancing across the room, his face caught the light in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten, not immediately with recognition, but with a strange familiarity that settled in slowly, like a thought forming just out of reach. Ethan's hand, still resting lightly against the edge of the podium, tightened almost imperceptibly, his breath shallow for a moment before he forced it steady, his mind racing through possibilities he hadn't considered in years, because the past, as far as he was concerned, had been resolved, closed, filed away under decisions that made sense at the time, decisions that had led him here, to this stage, to this moment of success. But success had never accounted for this, for the reappearance of something he had chosen to leave behind, something that now stood in front of him not as a memory, but as a reality he could no longer ignore. And when Amara finally lifted her gaze, when her eyes met his across the distance that suddenly felt both vast and non-existent, there was no accusation in them, no visible anger, just a calm that unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could have, because it suggested closure, not for him, but for her. And in that calm, Ethan realized something he had never prepared for, something no strategy, no plan, no carefully constructed narrative could protect him from. The understanding that while he had been busy building a life designed to be seen, she had been building a life that didn't need his approval to exist. And now, standing there under the lights he once believed defined his worth, Ethan Cole felt, for the first time in years, completely unprepared for what came next. The silence after recognition does not arrive all at once. It builds, layer by layer, like a pressure that no one else in the room can feel. And Ethan stood there still holding the room without actually holding it anymore, because although his body remained at the podium, his focus had already shifted completely, pulled toward a version of his life he had long decided no longer belonged to him. And yet there she was, not in memory, not softened by time, but real, composed, and impossibly steady. And the longer he looked, the more something inside him began to unravel in a way he could not control or even explain. The applause that followed his unfinished sentence came late, uneven, uncertain, as if the audience sensed something had changed but could not name it, and Ethan nodded slightly, stepping back from the microphone with practiced grace, letting the host recover the moment while he moved down from the stage, each step measured, deliberate, controlled, the same way he had walked through every high-stakes negotiation in his career, but this time the calculation felt thinner, like it was trying to cover something deeper that refused to stay hidden. Across the room, Amara did not look at him again immediately, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because she was not waiting for him to approach, not preparing for a confrontation, not even acknowledging the weight of his presence. Instead, she moved toward a smaller cluster of attendees near the side of the ballroom, greeting them with a quiet confidence that suggested familiarity, not as someone entering a foreign space, but as someone returning to a place she already understood. And the people around her responded in kind, their posture shifting subtly, their attention aligning with hers. Not because of who she had been, but because of who she had become. Ethan slowed his pace without realizing it, watching the interaction from a distance that felt both safe and unbearable, his mind moving through fragments of memory that no longer aligned with what he was seeing. Because the woman he remembered had not carried herself like this, had not commanded a room without effort, had not drawn attention without trying. And yet here she was, doing all of it without raising her voice or demanding recognition, simply existing in a way that made everything around her adjust accordingly. Then there was the child, still close at her side, observant in a way that suggested awareness beyond his years, his gaze moving across the room not with curiosity, but with quiet understanding, as if he had been in environments like this before and knew how to navigate them without instruction. And when one of the attendees bent slightly to speak to him, the boy responded with a small, polite nod, his voice low and clear, his composure steady, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest again, because there was something unmistakably familiar in the way the child held himself, something that mirrored a version of Ethan he recognized from his own childhood photographs, from stories his mother used to tell, from habits he had never consciously learned but always carried. Ethan stopped near a column just beyond the main floor, positioning himself where he could observe without being immediately seen, a habit developed over years of managing both business and perception. And for a moment, he told himself this was just that: observation, analysis, gathering information before acting. But the truth beneath that reasoning was far less structured, far more personal, because he was not preparing for a negotiation. He was trying to understand something that did not fit within the frameworks he trusted. 5 years had passed, 5 years in which he had built, expanded, refined, and secured everything he once believed defined success. And yet in those same 5 years, there had been moments, quiet ones, brief and easily dismissed, when something felt incomplete, when the silence in his penthouse lingered longer than expected, when the absence of a voice he used to hear daily created a gap he could not fully explain. But he had always moved past those moments quickly, redirecting his focus, reinforcing his decisions, reminding himself of the clarity he had when he chose this path. And now, standing here, that clarity felt less certain, not erased, but questioned in a way that unsettled him deeply. Amara shifted slightly, placing a gentle hand on the child's shoulder as she leaned down to say something to him, her voice too soft to carry across the distance. But the gesture itself spoke clearly, protective, grounded, present, and the boy responded with a small smile, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to show comfort, familiarity, and something else that Ethan could not immediately name but felt compelled to understand. The music in the room adjusted, transitioning into a softer arrangement as the evening progressed, conversations deepening, deals forming, connections strengthening. But for Ethan, the external rhythm of the event had become secondary, background noise to a realization that continued to grow stronger with every passing second, because the longer he watched, the more undeniable the connection became, not based on assumption, not based on coincidence, but on a series of small, precise details that aligned too closely to ignore: the angle of the child's posture, the way he tilted his head slightly when listening, the calm steadiness in his expression, all of it reflecting something Ethan knew intimately, something he had never seen replicated outside of himself. He exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders to relax, his expression neutral, composed, the way it had always been in moments that required control. But inside, the shift was undeniable, because this was no longer about curiosity, no longer about reconnecting with someone from his past. This was about a possibility he had never considered, a reality he had never allowed himself to imagine. And the weight of that realization began to settle in, not all at once, but steadily, like something inevitable. Across the room, Amara finally looked up again, her gaze moving briefly through the crowd before settling, intentionally or not, in his direction. And for a second, their eyes met once more. And this time, there was something different in the space between them, not tension, not unresolved conflict, but a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, something that could not be undone or ignored. And she did not look away quickly. She held that gaze just long enough to confirm that she saw him, that she recognized him, and that whatever came next would not be dictated by the past he had chosen, but by the life she had built without him. And then, just as calmly, she turned her attention back to the conversation beside her, leaving Ethan standing there, not rejected, not dismissed, but no longer central to her world. And for the first time in years, that realization did not feel like a challenge to overcome. It felt like a truth he had to face. There are moments when truth does not arrive with words but with a pattern, a quiet alignment of details that refuse to be dismissed, and Ethan felt it now, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow tightening in his chest that grew sharper with every second he remained where he was, watching from a distance that no longer protected him from what he was beginning to understand. The room continued its elegant rhythm around him, glasses clinking softly, conversations layered in low tones, the hum of wealth and influence flowing uninterrupted. Yet none of it reached him the same way anymore, because his focus had narrowed, locked onto a single point that pulled everything else out of clarity. Amara stood with ease among people who carried names that once defined his world, and yet she did not lean into them, did not seek validation or recognition. She existed beside them as an equal, and that subtle distinction was impossible to ignore because Ethan had spent years watching how people moved in rooms like this, who deferred, who commanded, who blended into the background, and who became the center without asking. And Amara was not blending. She was not adjusting. She was being followed, not physically, but in attention, in the quiet shift of posture from those around her, in the way conversations tilted slightly toward her presence without her needing to direct them. The child remained close, but not hidden, not shielded, his presence integrated into hers as naturally as breath. And when a man in a dark suit extended a hand toward him with a polite greeting, the boy responded without hesitation, offering his own small hand with a composure that felt practiced but not forced, his voice carrying just enough to reveal confidence without arrogance. And Ethan felt the echo of something deeply familiar in that moment, something that reached past observation into recognition. He moved then, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with a quiet intention that surprised even himself, stepping away from the column and into the open flow of the room, his expression composed, his posture aligned with the version of himself that never hesitated, never faltered, because that was who he had trained himself to be. But beneath that surface, the certainty he relied on was shifting, reshaping itself around a possibility he could no longer ignore. Each step toward her felt longer than it should have, not physically, but internally, because with every movement forward, the distance between what he believed about his past and what he was now seeing narrowed, forcing him to confront the space where those two realities collided. Amara sensed him before he reached her, not because he announced himself, but because awareness like hers did not rely on noise. And when she turned, her gaze met his again, steady, unguarded, and entirely in control. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying more weight than any words could have held. Ethan stopped just within conversational distance, close enough to see the subtle details he had missed before, the calm in her eyes that did not come from indifference, but from something built over time, something earned, something that did not depend on him or his approval. And he realized, almost immediately, that whatever version of Amara he had known before no longer existed in the way he remembered. Amara, he said, his voice even, controlled, but quieter than usual, as if instinctively adjusting to the tone she had set without needing to ask. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging him without surprise, without hesitation. "Ethan," she replied, her voice smooth, grounded, carrying no trace of the past that once connected them. And that absence struck him harder than any accusation could have. For a moment, the conversation around them softened, not because others stopped speaking, but because Ethan's focus had narrowed completely, and everything outside of this exchange faded into a distant hum. His eyes shifted briefly, drawn once again to the child, who stood beside her with a natural ease that suggested familiarity with moments like this, not intimidated, not curious, simply present. And when the boy looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze directly, something in that look settled the final piece of a pattern Ethan had been trying to deny. It was not just resemblance, not just similarity. It was alignment, precise and undeniable, the kind that does not require confirmation because it speaks in details too exact to be coincidence. Ethan's breath slowed, his thoughts tightening into clarity, and for the first time since he had seen them, the question that had been forming without words found its shape, not spoken yet, but fully realized within him. Amara noticed the shift, not in his posture, not in his expression, but in the stillness that settled over him, the kind that only comes when someone arrives at a truth they can no longer avoid. And she did not interrupt it, did not fill the silence. She allowed it to exist, to take its place, to become something he would have to carry forward on his own. "You look well," Ethan said finally, the words simple, almost insufficient, but they were not meant to capture everything. They were a bridge, a starting point, something that allowed him to speak without revealing the full weight of what he was beginning to understand. Amara's expression did not change, but there was a subtle acknowledgement in her eyes. "I am," she answered, not with pride, not with defiance, but with certainty, the kind that does not need reinforcement. The child shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the fabric of her dress as he adjusted his stance, and Ethan's attention followed the movement, drawn once again to the details he could no longer ignore. The line of the boy's jaw, the shape of his eyes, the quiet steadiness in the way he held himself. All of it reflecting something Ethan had seen every day of his life without ever expecting to see it outside of himself. And this is, Ethan began, the sentence forming slowly, carefully, as if each word needed to be measured before it was allowed to exist. Because once spoken, it would not be something he could take back or reshape. Amara did not rush to answer, did not soften the moment. She simply rested her hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, a gesture that grounded both of them in the present. And then she said his name, clear, calm, unmistakable. "This is Elijah." And the name settled between them, simple, complete, and yet carrying a weight that extended far beyond its sound. Elijah looked up again, his gaze steady, meeting Ethan's without hesitation, and in that moment, the final barrier of doubt dissolved, leaving only the truth that had been building since the moment Ethan first saw them. A truth that did not need confirmation, did not need explanation, because it was already written in every detail he could not ignore. Ethan's world, carefully constructed over years of calculated decisions, did not collapse, it did not shatter, it shifted, quietly, profoundly, in a way that redefined everything he thought he understood about the life he had chosen and the life he had left behind. And standing there, facing the woman who no longer belonged to his past, and the child who undeniably carried his presence into the future, Ethan realized that the success he had spent years building had never prepared him for this moment, because this was not something he could control, negotiate, or walk away from. This was something he had to face. Fully, completely, whether he was ready or not. There is a kind of silence that does not come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something too heavy to ignore, and Ethan felt it settle around him as the name lingered in the air. Elijah, simple, undeniable, final, and for a moment, everything else in the room seemed to fall into the background, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer mattered in the way it had only minutes before. He looked at the boy again, not as an observer this time, not as someone trying to make sense of a resemblance, but as someone facing a reality that had already taken shape without his knowledge, and the clarity of it was almost disorienting, not dramatic, not overwhelming in the way he had always imagined life-altering moments would be, but steady, precise, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for him to catch up. Elijah did not step back, did not hide behind Amara. He remained where he was, grounded, aware, his posture relaxed yet attentive, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet confidence that felt far beyond his years. "It is nice to meet you," he said, the words polite, measured, and unmistakably deliberate. And something about the way he spoke, the rhythm of his tone, the calm steadiness behind it, struck Ethan with a familiarity that went deeper than appearance. It was behavioral, instinctive, something that could not be taught in a moment or borrowed from observation. It was something that lived in the foundation of who he was. Ethan nodded, slightly, acknowledging him, his expression controlled but softer than it had been when he first stepped off the stage. "It is nice to meet you too," he replied, and even to his own ears, his voice sounded different, not weaker, but stripped of the sharp precision he usually carried, as if the moment required something more honest than the persona he had perfected over the years. Amara watched the exchange without interruption, her gaze steady, not protective in a defensive way, but present, aware, and entirely in control of the space she occupied. And there was no tension in her posture, no urgency to explain or clarify. She allowed the moment to unfold naturally, as if she had already accepted whatever direction it would take long before Ethan stepped into it. The music shifted again, a soft instrumental rising through the room, blending with the low murmur of conversation, but the space around them remained distinct, not isolated, but separate in a way that made everything within it feel more focused, more defined. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind moving through the implications of what stood in front of him, not in a scattered way, but in a structured sequence, the way he approached every complex situation in his professional life. Identifying variables, assessing outcomes, calculating responses, But this was not a negotiation, not a problem to solve. It was something far more personal, something that required him to move beyond the frameworks he trusted, and that realization unsettled him more than he expected. "How old is he?" he asked, the question direct, but quieter than his usual tone, not demanding, not probing, simply seeking a piece of information he already knew would confirm what he had begun to accept. Amara did not hesitate. "4," she answered, her voice even, the number landing with a precision that aligned too perfectly with the timeline Ethan could not ignore, and for a brief second, the past and the present aligned completely, removing any remaining space for doubt. Ethan's gaze shifted again to Elijah, taking in the details with a new understanding, not searching anymore, but recognizing. And with that recognition came something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, not regret in the dramatic sense, not guilt in the way people often described it, but a quiet awareness of absence, of time that had moved forward without him, of moments he had not been part of a life that had developed fully in his absence without waiting for his return. "You have done well," he said after a moment, his attention returning to Amara, the words simple, but carrying more weight than they appeared, because they were not just about her presence in the room, they were about everything that had led to it, everything he had not seen, everything she had built without him. Amara's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, not pride, not validation, but acknowledgement. "I built what I needed," she replied, the phrasing deliberate, not centered on success as he defined it, but on necessity, on purpose, on something far more grounded than the metrics he had spent years chasing. Ethan absorbed the words, understanding their implication without needing further explanation, because they drew a clear line between the paths they had taken, between the reasons behind their choices, and for the first time, he saw that his decision had not just changed his life, it had set hers on a trajectory he had never considered, one that had led her here, to this moment. Standing in front of him with a presence that did not depend on him in any way, Elijah shifted slightly, his attention moving between them, not confused, not uncertain, but observant, as if he understood that this moment held significance even if its full meaning had not been explained to him. And there was a quiet patience in the way he stood, a willingness to let the conversation unfold without interruption, something that felt both natural and remarkably composed. Ethan noticed it, that patience, that restraint, and it added another layer to the realization forming within him, because it was not just about resemblance anymore. It was about presence, about the way Elijah occupied space, the way he listened, the way he responded, all of it reflecting something that Ethan recognized not from observation, but from experience. "Does he know?" Ethan asked, the question emerging before he could fully filter it, not accusatory, not demanding, but carrying a weight that shifted the tone of the moment slightly, because it moved beyond acknowledgement into something deeper, something that required clarity. Amara did not react immediately. She considered him for a brief second, not evaluating the question itself, but the intent behind it, and when she spoke, her voice remained steady. "He knows what he needs to know," she said, the answer. Measured, not evasive, but controlled, leaving space for interpretation while maintaining her authority over the narrative. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that the conversation had reached a point where assumptions would not be enough, where clarity would eventually be necessary, but also recognizing that this was not a moment he could force, not a situation he could direct, because for the first time, he was not the one setting the terms. The realization settled in quietly, but firmly, and with it came a shift in his perspective, not immediate, not complete, but undeniable, because standing there, facing the woman he had left behind and the child who carried a part of him into a future he had not been part of, Ethan began to understand that whatever came next would not be about reclaiming something he had lost. It would be about confronting something he had never chosen to face. And for the first time in years, that uncertainty did not feel like something he could resolve quickly. It felt like something he would have to earn the right to understand. Some truths do not ask for permission to change your life. They arrive fully formed and wait for you to decide what kind of man you will be when you face them. And as Ethan stood there with the weight of Amara's words settling into something heavier than he had expected, He realized that the room around him had not changed at all, yet everything within him had shifted in a way he could not reverse. The music continued. The conversations flowed. The evening carried on as if nothing significant had happened. But for Ethan, the definition of significance had just been rewritten, because standing in front of him was not just a reflection of his past. It was a living extension of it, shaped, raised, and guided entirely without him. And the quiet control he had relied on for years felt thinner now, less absolute, as if it had been built to manage everything except this. Amara adjusted her stance slightly, her hand still resting lightly on Elijah's shoulder, not holding him in place, not restraining him, just present, a connection that did not need to be emphasized to be understood. And there was something in that simplicity that Ethan could not ignore, because it spoke of consistency, of years spent building something steady, something reliable, something that did not depend on performance or recognition. And that stood in stark contrast to the life he had constructed, where everything was visible, measured, and constantly evaluated. "We should not do this here," Amara said. After a moment, her voice calm, not dismissive, not resistant, simply practical, and Ethan recognized the truth in that immediately, because whatever this conversation was becoming, it was not meant for a room filled with observers. Even if those observers were too absorbed in their own worlds to fully notice what was unfolding at the edge of theirs. He nodded once. "I agree." His response quick, but measured. And for a brief moment, there was a shared understanding between them. Not of the past, not of what had been lost or gained, but of the present, of the need to move this moment into a space where it could exist without interruption. Elijah looked up at Amara, his expression curious but calm. "Are we leaving?" he asked, his voice steady. And there was no hesitation in her response, no need to explain beyond what was necessary. "Yes, for a little while," she said, her tone gentle but firm. And he accepted it without question, nodding slightly as if he understood that some moments required privacy, even if he did not yet know why. Ethan watched the exchange closely, noting the ease of it, the absence of tension, the quiet trust that existed between them, and it added another layer to what he was beginning to understand, because this was not a dynamic that had formed quickly or by chance. It was something built over time, reinforced through consistency. And that realization carried a weight he could not easily set aside. "There is a lounge just past the east hallway," Ethan said, gesturing slightly, his voice returning to a more familiar tone, though still softened by the moment. "It will be quieter there." And Amara considered him briefly, not questioning his suggestion, but measuring it against her own judgment, and after a second, she nodded. "All right," she replied, the agreement simple, but deliberate. The three of them moved together then, not as a unit, not yet, but in the same direction, and as they stepped away from the main floor, the shift in atmosphere was immediate, the noise dimming slightly, the lighting softening, the intensity of the room giving way to something more contained, more private, and with each step, Ethan felt the distance between his public life and this moment grow clearer, more defined. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with subtle lighting that reflected softly off polished surfaces, the sound of their footsteps quiet but steady. And for a moment, none of them spoke, not out of discomfort, but because the silence itself held meaning. It allowed the weight of what had been revealed to settle, to take shape without being interrupted by words that might come too quickly, too defensively. Ethan walked slightly ahead, not out of dominance, but out of habit, guiding the path while still aware of their presence behind him. And as they reached the entrance to the lounge, he paused, holding the door open, a small gesture, almost automatic, but one that carried a subtle shift in tone, because it was not about control, it was about acknowledgement, about creating space rather than directing it. Amara entered first, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, and Elijah followed at her side, his gaze moving briefly around the room, taking in the quieter setting with the same calm awareness he had shown before, and Ethan stepped in after them, allowing the door to close softly behind him, sealing the space in a way that felt intentional, contained, and entirely separate from the world just beyond it. The lounge was understated, comfortable without being excessive, a place designed for conversations that required discretion, And for the first time since the moment began, Ethan allowed himself to fully turn toward them, not as a speaker addressing an audience, not as a leader managing perception, but as a man standing in front of a reality he could no longer avoid. He took a breath, slower this time, more deliberate, as if grounding himself in something more stable than the shifting thoughts that had followed him since the ballroom. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight, less controlled, more direct. "I think we need to talk," he said, the statement simple, but carrying the acknowledgement that what stood between them was no longer something that could remain unspoken. Amara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, but there was a clarity in her eyes that had not been there before, not because it was new, but because the setting now allowed it to be seen more fully. "We do," she replied, her voice steady, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by time or absence, but by something far more immediate, the need to confront a truth that had already reshaped all of their lives, whether they had been ready for it or not. The moment a door closes behind you, separating noise from truth, is often the moment everything you avoided begins to speak. And as the soft click of the lounge door settled into silence, Ethan felt the weight of what had followed him from the ballroom finally land in full, no longer softened by distance or distraction, no longer blurred by the presence of an audience, just real, immediate, and impossible to step away from. The room was quieter, the lighting warmer, the space designed for conversations that required discretion, but none of that changed the tension that now existed between them, not sharp, not hostile, but steady, like something that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment to unfold. Amara moved first, not in a way that claimed the room, but in a way that settled into it. Choosing a seat near the center, her posture relaxed yet grounded, Elijah. Beside her, close but not clinging, his small frame upright, his eyes moving between them with a quiet awareness that suggested he understood more than his age might imply, and Ethan remained standing for a second longer than necessary, as if the act of sitting would confirm that this was no longer a passing interaction, but something he had to engage with fully. When he finally took a seat across from them, the distance between them felt deliberate, not far, not close, just enough to acknowledge that what stood between them was not something that could be bridged casually. And for a moment, none of them spoke, not out of uncertainty, but because the silence itself carried weight. It allowed the truth that had been revealed to settle into something more defined. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting loosely together, his posture controlled, but there was a shift in his presence now, less guarded, less performative, as if the environment no longer required him to maintain the version of himself he had perfected for the outside world. And when he spoke, his voice reflected that shift. "You should have told me," he said, the words direct, not accusatory, but carrying an undercurrent of something unresolved, something that had not yet found its place within him. Amara did not react immediately. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and when she spoke, her tone remained calm, measured. "You made it clear you did not want anything that did not fit your future," she replied, the words simple, but precise, and they landed with a clarity that did not require emphasis. Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing the response, recognizing the truth in it even if it did not sit comfortably, because he remembered that conversation, remembered the certainty with which he had drawn that line, the confidence he had in his decision, and now, sitting here, facing the outcome of that choice, he could see it from a perspective he had never considered at the time. "That does not mean I would have walked away from this," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, as if choosing each word carefully, not to control the narrative, but to express something he had not fully articulated even to himself. Amara's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, not skepticism, not disbelief, but recognition, as if she had expected that answer long before he spoke it. "You already did," she replied, her voice steady, not harsh, not emotional, just factual, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have. Elijah remained quiet, his presence steady, his gaze moving between them, not confused, not distressed, but attentive, as if he understood that this conversation was not about him in the way it might seem, but about something larger, something that shaped the space around him even if it had not been explained in Full. Ethan's hands tightened slightly before relaxing again. A small movement. Almost imperceptible, but it marked a shift, because for the first time in a long time, he found himself without a clear response, not because he lacked the ability to speak, but because the truth of her words left little room for deflection, little space for reinterpretation. "I did not know," he said after a moment, the statement quieter now, less certain, not as a defense, but as an acknowledgement of a gap he could not fill retroactively. Amara inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, not in disagreement, just acknowledgement. "No, you did not," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no attempt to assign blame, just a statement of fact, and that absence of confrontation unsettled him more than any anger might have, because it removed the possibility of arguing his way out of the moment. It left him with nothing but the reality itself. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not tense, but reflective, as if each of them was processing the same truth from different perspectives. And in that space, Ethan's attention shifted again to Elijah, to the quiet steadiness in the boy's posture, to the way he remained present without inserting himself into the conversation, and the realization that had been forming since the ballroom settled more firmly into place, no longer a question, no longer a possibility, but a certainty. "Elijah," Ethan said, his voice softening slightly as he addressed him directly, and the boy looked up immediately, attentive. "Yes?" he responded, his tone calm, respectful, and something about that exchange, simple as it was, reinforced everything Ethan was beginning to understand. Ethan paused for a brief second, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that whatever he said next would carry weight, not just for him, but for the child sitting in front of him, and for the woman who had carried this reality alone for years. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but stripped of the authority he usually relied on. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, the question direct, but gentle, leaving space for whatever answer might come. Elijah did not answer immediately. He looked briefly at Amara, not for permission, but for alignment, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not directing him, just affirming that he could respond freely. And then he looked back at Ethan, his gaze steady. "You are someone important to my mother," he said, the words carefully chosen, not incorrect, but incomplete, and in that incompleteness, Ethan felt the full weight of what had been withheld, not out of deception, but out of protection, out of intention, out of a decision that had been made long before this moment. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, understanding what it revealed and what it did not, and for the first time, he recognized that whatever role he might have had in this child's life had not just been absent, it had been replaced, redefined, reshaped into something that existed entirely outside of him, and that realization did not come with immediate clarity about what to do next. It came with a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be something he could control, it would be something he would have to approach, with a patience he had never needed before. And as he sat there, across from the life he had unknowingly left behind, Ethan Cole understood that this was not a moment he could resolve. It was the beginning of something he would have to learn to face, step by step, without the certainty he had always relied on. Some realizations do not arrive as answers, but as questions you cannot stop asking. And as the quiet weight of Elijah's words settled into the space between them, Ethan felt something shift again, not in the room, not in Amara, but within himself, because for the first time since he had built his life on certainty, he found himself standing inside a reality that did not respond to control, did not adjust to his timing, and did not bend to the logic he had always trusted. Elijah's answer lingered, simple, respectful, and incomplete, and in that incompleteness, Ethan understood something that had not yet been said aloud, that his absence had not left a void waiting to be filled, it had been replaced with stability, with intention, with a structure that did not include him, and the clarity of that realization carried a quiet impact that did not need to be expressed to be fully felt. Ethan leaned back slightly, not retreating, but adjusting, as if recalibrating his position within a situation that no longer followed the rules he knew, his gaze moving briefly to Amara before returning to Elijah, studying him not with scrutiny, but with recognition, and the more he looked, the more undeniable the connection became, not just in physical resemblance, but in the way Elijah processed the moment, the patience in his stillness, the thoughtfulness in his response. All of it reflecting something Ethan knew intimately, yet had never expected to see mirrored outside of himself. That is a careful answer, Ethan said after a moment, his voice softer now, less defined by authority and more by curiosity, and Elijah tilted his head slightly, considering the statement before responding. My mother says that not every truth needs to be rushed, he replied, and there was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty, just a calm delivery that suggested this was not something he had been taught to say, but something he had come to understand. Ethan's gaze shifted to Amara again, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not conflict, but recognition, because the words Elijah spoke carried her influence, her choices, her way of shaping the world around him. And it was in that moment that Ethan fully grasped the depth of what had been built in his absence, not just a life, but a perspective, a foundation, a sense of identity that did not require his presence to exist. You have raised him well, Ethan said, the acknowledgement quiet, genuine, and free of the polished tone he would have used in any other setting, and Amara inclined her head slightly, accepting the statement without reacting to it. I raised him the way I needed to, she replied, her words consistent with everything she had said before, grounded in necessity, not validation. And Ethan understood that distinction clearly now, because everything she had done, everything she had built, had not been for recognition. It had been for survival, for stability, for something far more enduring than approval. The room remained still, the quiet between them no longer uncomfortable, but intentional, as if each of them understood that this conversation was not about filling silence with words, but about allowing meaning to settle into place. And for the first time, Ethan did not feel the need to move the moment forward quickly, did not feel the urge to regain control of its direction. He simply remained where he was, present, aware, and listening. Why did you not tell him? Ethan asked after a pause, his voice measured, not challenging, but searching, because the absence of that truth had become as significant as the truth itself. And Amara did not answer immediately. She looked at Elijah for a brief second, not for permission, but for alignment, and then returned her gaze to Ethan. Because he did not need to grow up waiting for someone who chose not to stay, she said, her tone steady, and the words settled into the space between them with a clarity that did not invite argument. Ethan absorbed the statement slowly, not resisting it, not dismissing it, but processing it in a way that required him to confront not just the outcome, but the reasoning behind it. And in that reasoning, he found something he could not easily challenge, because it was built on the same kind of logic he had used when he made his decision years ago, a logic centered on what he believed was best at the time. Except now, that logic existed on the other side of the choice, and it did not serve him in the way it once had. Elijah remained quiet, his gaze thoughtful, as if he understood that this part of the conversation carried weight beyond what was being said directly, and Ethan noticed it. The awareness in the boy's expression, the way he listened without interrupting, without needing to assert himself, and it reinforced the understanding that this was not a child who had grown up in uncertainty. This was someone who had been given clarity in the way it mattered most, through consistency, through presence, through a life that did not revolve around absence. Ethan's hands rested loosely in front of him now, no longer tense, no longer controlled in the way they had been earlier. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, one that reflected not just recognition, but acceptance of something he could no longer reshape. I cannot change what I did, he said, the statement simple, but carrying the weight of acknowledgement. And for a moment, the room held that truth without reaction, without judgment, just allowing it to exist. Amara nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. No, you cannot, she replied. And there was no edge to her words, no bitterness, just a calm acceptance of reality as it was. And that absence of resentment did not make the moment easier for Ethan. It made it clearer, because it removed any illusion that this could be resolved through apology or explanation alone. Elijah looked between them again, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle curiosity in his eyes now, not confusion, not concern. Just an awareness that something important was being understood. even if it had not yet been fully explained. And Ethan met his gaze once more, this time not searching for confirmation, not trying to prove anything, but simply acknowledging what was there, what had always been there, waiting for him to see it. And in that quiet acknowledgement, something settled, not resolved, not complete, but grounded, because for the first time since the moment began, Ethan was no longer trying to understand what had happened. He was beginning to understand what it meant, and that understanding did not come with immediate answers. It came with a realization that whatever path existed from this moment forward would not be defined by what he wanted, but by what he was willing to face. And for the first time in a long time, that was not something he could predict, control, or guarantee. It was something he would have to earn, step by step, in a way he had never needed to before. Some truths do not break you all at once. They settle into your life quietly and begin to reshape everything you thought was solid. And as Ethan sat there across from Amara and Elijah, he felt that shift deepen, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like something inside him was being recalibrated in real time, forcing him to see beyond the version of himself he had spent years perfecting. The silence that followed his last words was not empty. It was full, filled with everything that had been said and everything that had not yet been spoken. And for the first time, Ethan did not rush to fill it, did not reach for control. He let it exist, let it stretch, because he understood now that this moment was not about speed or precision. It was about presence. Elijah shifted slightly in his seat, his small hands resting calmly in his lap, his posture unchanged. But there was a subtle awareness in the way he watched Ethan now, not with curiosity alone, but with a quiet evaluation, as if he was forming his own understanding of the man in front of him, not based on what he had been told, but on what he could see for himself. And that realization alone carried a weight Ethan had not anticipated, because he was no longer just confronting his past. He was being seen in the present by someone who had not known him at all. "You are thinking a lot," Elijah said softly, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, just an observation. And Ethan looked at him, slightly surprised, not by the words themselves, but by the clarity behind them. "I am," he admitted, his voice steady but quieter than before. And there was no hesitation in the admission, no need to hide it, because the truth of it was evident in everything about him. Elijah nodded once, as if that answer made sense, as if he expected nothing less. And then he added, "My mom says thinking is good, but it does not matter unless you decide what to do next." And the simplicity of the statement landed with a precision that caught Ethan off guard, because it cut through everything he had been processing and brought it down to something direct, something actionable, something he could not avoid. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly to Amara, and she met it without surprise, without interruption, as if she had heard those words many times before, as if she had been the one to shape that understanding in Elijah long before this moment. And there was no pride in her expression, no need for recognition, just a quiet confirmation that what had been built between them was intentional, deliberate, and strong. "He listens well," Ethan said, the observation genuine, and Amara inclined her head slightly. "He understands well," she replied, the distinction subtle, but important, and Ethan recognized it immediately, because listening could be taught, but understanding came from something deeper, something developed over time through consistency and trust. The room remained still, the outside world completely removed from the space they occupied, and for the first time since the conversation began, Ethan allowed himself to consider not just what had happened, but what was possible, not in a strategic sense, not in the calculated way he approached opportunities, but in a more uncertain, more unfamiliar way, one that required him to step into something he could not fully control. "I would like to know him," Ethan said after a moment, his voice measured, not demanding, not assuming, but clear, and the statement hung in the air, not as a request alone, but as an acknowledgement of something he had not been part of and now wanted to understand. Amara did not respond immediately. She held his gaze, steady, thoughtful, and there was no immediate rejection, no visible resistance. But there was also no immediate acceptance, just consideration, the kind that carried weight, because it was not based on emotion, it was based on responsibility, on protection, on everything she had built in his absence. That is not a simple decision. she said finally, her voice calm, and Ethan nodded slightly, understanding that immediately. Because nothing about this was simple, not anymore, not after everything that had already been set into motion. Elijah looked between them again, his expression thoughtful, and then he spoke, not interrupting, but contributing in a way that felt natural. You can know someone slowly, he said, his voice soft but clear. That is how I learned things. And the statement, simple as it was, shifted the tone of the conversation again, because it introduced something Ethan had not yet considered fully. Not just the possibility of connection, but the pace of it, the way it might unfold over time rather than all at once. Ethan looked at him, truly looked this time, not searching, not analyzing, just seeing. And there was something in that moment that grounded him, something that made the situation feel less like a problem to solve and more like a path to walk, uncertain, unstructured, but real. Slowly, Ethan repeated, the words settling into his thoughts, and for the first time, it did not feel like a limitation. It felt like something necessary, something that aligned with the reality in front of him. Amara watched the exchange carefully, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held her gaze, not softer, not more open, but more aware, as if she was recognizing something in Ethan that had not been there before, not in the past, not in the moment he chose to leave, but here, now, in the way he was no longer trying to control the outcome, but beginning to understand the process. If this happens, she said, her voice steady, it will be on terms that protect him, not you. And the clarity of that statement left no room for misinterpretation, no space for negotiation in the way Ethan was used to. And yet, instead of resisting it, he nodded, because for the first time, he understood that this was not about him, not about what he wanted, but about what he was willing to respect. I understand, he said, and the words carried a sincerity that was not forced, not constructed, just present. And in that moment, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to change the direction of what could come next. Because for the first time since this began, Ethan was not trying to reclaim control. He was beginning to accept that this was something he would have to approach differently, with patience, with humility, with a willingness to move at a pace he did not set. And as he sat there, across from the woman who had rebuilt her life without him and the child who had grown within that life, Ethan Cole realized that whatever came next would not be defined by what he had lost, but by what he chose to do with what was now in front of him. Some moments do not demand a decision immediately. They ask for something far more difficult, the willingness to remain present without knowing what the outcome will be. And as Ethan sat across from Amara and Elijah, the weight of that understanding settled deeper into him, not as pressure, but as a quiet shift in how he approached everything that came next. The room held a calm stillness, not empty, but grounded, as if the space itself understood that what was unfolding within it could not be rushed, could not be forced into clarity before it was ready. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not try to accelerate the moment. He allowed it to exist exactly as it was. Elijah adjusted slightly in his seat, his attention moving from Ethan to the soft lighting around the room, then back again, not distracted, just observant. And there was something about the way he existed in that space that felt complete, not seeking approval, not waiting for validation, simply present in a way that suggested he had never needed to question his place in the world. Ethan noticed it again, that quiet confidence, and it deepened something within him, not regret in the way it is often described, but an awareness of time, of years that had moved forward without him, of moments that had shaped this child into who he was now, moments Ethan had not witnessed, had not contributed to, and could not reclaim. What does he like? Ethan asked after a moment, his voice softer now, less structured. The question simple, but meaningful, because it was not about confirming facts. It was about understanding a person, and Amara's gaze shifted briefly to Elijah before returning to Ethan. He likes building things, she said, her tone steady. Not just toys, real ideas, structures, how things work. And Ethan felt a subtle recognition in that, not because it surprised him, but because it aligned so naturally with what he knew of himself, of the way he had always approached the world, breaking it down, understanding it, reconstructing it into something functional, something purposeful. And stories, Elijah added, his voice calm. as if contributing to a conversation he was fully part of, but not just reading them, understanding why they matter. And Ethan nodded slowly, taking that in, because there was something layered in that statement, something that went beyond interest, something that spoke to how Elijah processed the world, how he connected meaning to experience. That is important, Ethan said, and Elijah nodded once, accepting the acknowledgement without needing more. And that exchange, small as it was, carried a quiet significance, because it marked the beginning of something new, not a bond, not yet, but a recognition, a moment where Ethan was no longer observing from the outside, but beginning to engage, even if only slightly, even if only through questions that felt almost too simple for the weight they carried. Amara watched, carefully, not intervening, not guiding, just allowing the interaction to unfold naturally. And there was a balance in the way she held that space, protective without being restrictive, present without controlling, and Ethan saw it clearly now, the intentionality behind everything she did, the way she had built a life that did not rely on reaction, but on consistency, on decisions made quietly and held firmly over time. What about school? Ethan asked, his attention still on Elijah, and Elijah answered before Amara could. I like it, he said, but not everything. Some things feel like they are just there to fill time. And Ethan allowed a small, almost unnoticeable smile to form, because the honesty in that response, the way it balanced respect with independent thought, felt familiar in a way that was both grounding and disorienting. That does not change, Ethan replied, and Elijah considered that for a second before nodding, as if accepting the idea that some things remain constant regardless of where you are. The conversation continued in this quiet rhythm, not forced, not structured, but flowing naturally, and with each exchange, Ethan felt the distance between himself and this moment shift slightly, not closing completely, not disappearing, but becoming something he could navigate rather than something he stood outside of. Yet beneath that slow movement forward, there was still the weight of everything that had come before, the absence, the choice he had made, the years that had shaped Elijah without him, and Ethan knew that no amount of conversation in this moment could erase that, could bridge that gap entirely. It was something that would remain, something that would have to be acknowledged not just once, but continuously. Amara leaned back slightly, her gaze steady, watching not just Ethan, not just Elijah, but the space between them, the way it shifted, the way it held, and there was no urgency in her expression, no need to push the moment forward. She allowed it to develop at its own pace, because she understood something Ethan was only beginning to learn, that some connections are not built through intention alone, they are built through time, through consistency, through presence that does not demand immediate recognition. We should go soon, Amara said after a while, her voice calm, not cutting the moment short, but guiding it to a natural pause. And Elijah nodded, accepting the transition without resistance, as if he understood that this conversation was not ending, just shifting into something that would continue beyond this room. Ethan felt that shift immediately, the subtle closing of a moment that had not resolved everything, had not answered every question, but had opened something that could not be closed again, and he nodded. I understand, he said, his voice steady, but carrying a quiet recognition of what was being set into motion. Amara stood, her movement smooth, unhurried, and Elijah followed, his small hand once again finding its place near hers, not holding tightly, just present, and Ethan rose as well, the space between them returning, but not in the same way it had before, not as distance, but as something defined, something acknowledged. We will talk again, Ethan said, not as a question, not as a demand, but as a statement shaped by understanding, and Amara met his gaze, her expression unchanged, but there was a clarity in her response. If it is right, we will, she said, and there was no promise in it, no guarantee, just possibility, grounded in terms that did not belong to him alone. Elijah looked at Ethan one more time, his expression thoughtful, not distant, not close, just aware, and then he gave a small nod, a gesture simple, but meaningful, as if acknowledging something that had begun, even if it was not yet fully understood. And as the door opened again, letting the softer light of the hallway filter back into the room, Ethan stood there. For a second longer, watching as they stepped out, not disappearing, not leaving his life entirely, but moving forward in a way that did not wait for him. And in that moment, he understood something with a clarity that stayed with him long after they were gone, that this was not about reclaiming a place he had lost. It was about learning how to stand in a space he had never earned, and for the first time, that felt like something he was willing to face, even if he did not yet know how. The moment the door closed behind them, the silence did not leave with it. It stayed, settled into the room like something unfinished, and Ethan remained standing where he was, his hand still resting lightly against the back of the chair he had not fully stepped away from, his gaze fixed on the space they had just occupied as if the outline of their presence still lingered there. The lounge felt different now, not empty, but altered, as if the meaning of the room had shifted from a place of quiet conversation to a place where something irreversible had begun, and for a long moment, Ethan did not move, not because he was unsure, but because movement felt unnecessary, as if the act of stepping forward too quickly would disrupt the clarity that had finally settled in. Outside the room, the muted sound of the gala continued, distant, softened, like a world that still functioned exactly as it had before, but no longer held the same relevance, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steady, controlled, but deeper than before, as if he was grounding himself in something more real than the polished certainty he had relied on for years. He stepped toward the door, opening it not with urgency, but with intention, and as the light from the hallway filtered back in, it did not feel intrusive. It felt like a transition, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever had started inside that room was not meant to stay there. It would follow him, shape him, whether he chose to acknowledge it or not. The hallway stretched ahead, calm, composed, and as Ethan walked through it, his pace was slower than usual, not hesitant, but measured, each step carrying the weight of something he had not anticipated when he walked into the ballroom earlier that evening, something that had not existed in his plans, his projections, his carefully constructed future, and yet now felt more real than anything he had built deliberately. When he returned to the main floor, the contrast was immediate. The brightness of the lights, the movement of people, the energy of conversation, all of it felt louder, sharper, as if the world had been turned up a degree while he had been away, and yet he did not step back into it the same way. He did not re-enter as the man who had stood at the podium, commanding attention, directing focus. He entered as someone who had seen something that could not be unseen, and that difference, though invisible to others, defined everything about how he moved now. A few attendees approached him almost immediately, their expressions warm, professional, their words filled with praise, with interest, with opportunity. And Ethan responded as he always had, with precision, with clarity, his voice steady, his posture aligned. But there was a subtle distance in his engagement, not dismissive, not distracted, but aware, as if part of him remained elsewhere, anchored to a moment that had shifted his understanding in a way he could not easily compartmentalize. He answered questions, acknowledged compliments, moved through conversations with the same efficiency that had defined his career, but beneath that surface, something had changed, not in his capability, not in his composure, but in his focus, because for the first time, the metrics that once defined success felt incomplete, not irrelevant, but insufficient, as if they described only part of a life he was now beginning to see more fully. Across the room, the space where Amara had stood earlier felt different now, not empty, but significant, and Ethan found his gaze returning to it more than once, not out of habit, but out of recognition, because that space marked a point of change, a moment where the trajectory he had been following intersected with something he had not planned, something that did not align with his expectations, and yet felt undeniably important. The evening continued, the schedule unfolding as it was meant to, speeches, introductions, conversations flowing into one another seamlessly. And Ethan fulfilled his role within it with the same level of professionalism he always had, but the connection he felt to it had shifted, not broken, but redefined, because now there was something else, something that existed outside of this environment, something that could not be measured in the same terms, could not be presented in the same way. As the event began to wind down, the energy in the room softened, the conversations becoming less formal, more reflective, and Ethan found himself stepping away from the center more often, moving toward the edges, observing rather than directing, and in those quieter moments, his thoughts returned not to the deals he had made, not to the opportunities that had been presented, but to the conversation in the lounge, to the words that had been spoken, to the ones that had not, and to the realization that this was not something that would resolve itself overnight. It was something that would require time, patience, and a willingness to approach it without the certainty he was used to. When he finally left the ballroom, the night air greeted him with a cool steadiness that contrasted sharply with the warmth of the lights inside. And for a moment, he paused just outside the entrance, looking out over the quiet street, the city stretching beyond in a pattern of lights and movement that had always felt familiar, always felt like something he understood completely. But now, there was a subtle shift in that perception, not in the city itself, but in how he related to it. Because for the first time, the world he had built within it did not feel entirely complete. His car waited at the curb, the driver stepping forward as he approached, the motion practiced, expected, and Ethan acknowledged him with a small nod before taking his seat inside, the door closing softly behind him, creating a contained space that felt both familiar and newly reflective. As the car moved through the city streets, the lights passing by in a steady rhythm, Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze directed outward but unfocused, his mind not racing, not scattered, but moving with a quiet clarity that he had not felt before, because for the first time, he was not planning, not strategizing, not projecting outcomes. He was considering something far more immediate, far more personal, something that did not come with a clear path or a defined result. Elijah's voice lingered in his thoughts, the calm certainty in the way he spoke, the patience in his presence, the clarity in his understanding, and Ethan recognized something in that, something that did not come from chance, something that had been shaped deliberately over time, and that recognition carried with it a question that remained unanswered, not about what had happened, but about what could happen next, not in a sense of control, but in a sense of possibility. And as the city moved around him, steady, unchanged, Ethan understood something with a clarity that did not require explanation, that the life he had built had brought him exactly where he intended to go, but it had not prepared him for what he had found waiting there. And now, for the first time, the future he saw ahead was not defined by certainty, but by something far more unfamiliar, the need to step into something he could not fully control, something he would have to learn, moment by moment, without knowing exactly where it would lead. The city does not slow down for personal realizations. It moves at the same pace whether a life is shifting or not. And as Ethan stepped out of the car and into the quiet lobby of his building, the familiar rhythm of his world greeted him exactly as it always had, controlled, polished, predictable. Yet for the first time, that predictability did not feel like strength. It felt incomplete, as if something essential had been missing all along and had only now made itself known. The elevator ride up was silent, the soft hum of machinery the only sound accompanying him as the numbers climbed steadily, and Ethan stood there with his reflection staring back at him from the mirrored walls, the same composed expression, the same tailored presence, the same man the world recognized. Yet beneath that surface, there was a shift he could not ignore, a quiet awareness that the image he had built did not reflect the full scope of who he was or who he had yet to become. When the doors opened to his penthouse, the space greeted him with its usual stillness, expansive, immaculate, designed for comfort and efficiency, everything in its place, everything functioning exactly as it should, and yet the silence inside it felt different tonight, not peaceful, but pronounced, as if the absence within it had been amplified by what he had experienced earlier, by the presence of a life that had grown without him, by the sound of a voice that did not echo here. Ethan stepped inside, loosening his jacket slightly as he moved through the living area, his gaze sweeping across the clean lines, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching beyond in perfect symmetry. And for a moment, he paused, not because he had not seen this view 100 times before, but because it no longer held the same meaning. It no longer represented completion. It represented something partial, something that did not account for what he had just encountered. He set his keys down with a quiet precision, the small sound echoing more than it should have in the open space. And as he moved further into the apartment, his mind did not drift toward tomorrow's meetings or upcoming deals. It returned, again and again, to the lounge, to the conversation, to the calm steadiness in Elijah's voice, to the clarity in Amara's words, and to the realization that none of it had required him to exist, that everything he had seen had been built without waiting for him to arrive. Ethan poured a glass of water, the motion automatic, familiar, and as he leaned against the counter, he let the silence settle around him fully, not resisting it, not filling it with distraction, because for the first time, he understood that this silence was not something to avoid. It was something to listen to, something that carried meaning if he allowed it to. His thoughts moved slowly, not scattered, not overwhelmed, but deliberate, tracing back through the decisions he had made, not with regret, not yet, but with a new perspective, one that questioned not just what he had chosen, but why. And as he revisited that moment 5 years ago, standing in that office, speaking with certainty about a future he believed required sacrifice, he saw it differently now, not as a necessary step, but as a limited one, a decision made within a framework that did not account for everything that mattered. He set the glass down, his fingers resting briefly against the cool surface, and for the first time, he allowed a question to surface that he had not considered before, not about what he had lost, but about what he had never allowed himself to understand, what it meant to build something beyond success, beyond visibility, something that did not depend on recognition to have value. Elijah's words echoed again, simple, direct, it does not matter unless you decide what to do next. And Ethan felt the weight of that statement settle into him more fully now, not as advice, but as a challenge, because for all his experience, for all his success, this was a decision he had never faced, not one defined by data or outcomes, but by something far more uncertain, far more personal. He moved toward the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass, his own reflection layered over them, and for a moment, he studied it, not critically, not analytically, just observing, as if seeing himself from a distance for the first time, and in that reflection, he saw both the man he had become and the space where something else could exist, something he had not yet explored. The hours passed quietly, the night deepening, the city continuing its steady rhythm, and Ethan remained where he was, not restless, not distracted, but engaged in a way that felt unfamiliar, because he was not solving a problem, he was understanding one, not in the sense of fixing it, but in the sense of recognizing its depth, its complexity, its impact. When he finally moved away from the window, the decision was not sudden, not dramatic, it was subtle, but clear, and he reached for his phone, not out of habit, not to check messages or updates, but with intention, because for the first time, he understood that whatever came next would require action, not control, not certainty, but presence. He paused for a moment, considering, not hesitating, but choosing carefully, because this was not a call he could approach the way he approached everything else. This was not about efficiency. It was about respect, about timing, about understanding that what he was stepping into was not his to define alone. And as he stood there, the phone in his hand, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, Ethan Cole understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that the life he had built had brought him to a place of undeniable success, but it had also led him to a moment where success alone was no longer enough, and whatever he chose to do next would not just shape his future, it would define the kind of man he was willing to become. Some decisions are not made in a single moment. They unfold slowly, shaped by the quiet understanding that something within you has already begun to change. And as Ethan stood there with his phone still in his hand, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, he realized that what he was about to do was not about reclaiming control. It was about stepping into something uncertain with intention rather than hesitation. He did not scroll through contacts immediately, did not rush to act on impulse. Instead, he lowered the phone slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle fully, because for the first time in a long time, he understood that timing was not about efficiency. It was about respect, and whatever came next required more than a simple decision. It required a shift in how he approached everything that followed. The apartment remained still around him, the silence no longer empty, but filled with presence, with thought, with the quiet echo of voices that did not belong to this space yet had already changed it. And Ethan moved away from the window slowly, placing the phone down on the counter for a moment, not abandoning the decision, but grounding it, allowing himself to stand in the reality of it before acting. He walked through the apartment without a clear destination, his steps unhurried, his mind not scattered, but focused in a way that felt unfamiliar, not on outcomes, not on projections, but on meaning, on understanding what it meant to move forward in a way that was not defined by control. The memory of Elijah's voice returned again, steady, composed, carrying a clarity that did not depend on age or experience, and Ethan found himself replaying the conversation not for answers, but for insight, for the subtle details that revealed more than what had been said directly, the way Elijah listened, the way he responded, the way he held space without needing to fill it. And Ethan recognized something in that, something that challenged the way he had always approached life, not through stillness, but through action, not through patience, but through momentum. He stopped near the dining table, his gaze resting briefly on the empty chairs, the space designed for conversations that rarely extended beyond business or surface-level exchanges, and for a moment, he imagined something different, not fully formed, not detailed, just a shift, a presence that would change. The way that space felt, the way it functioned, the way it held meaning, and the thought lingered longer than he expected, not because it was clear, but because it was new. Ethan returned to the counter, picking up his phone again, this time with a steadier intention, and he scrolled through his contacts slowly, not searching aimlessly, but with focus, until he found what he needed, not a name he had saved recently, not something he could access easily, but a connection that required effort, that required him to step beyond convenience. He paused again, not hesitating, but considering, because this was not a call he could approach casually. This was not about reopening a conversation. It was about acknowledging that the conversation had never truly ended. It had simply continued without him. And now he was choosing to step back into it, not as the one who defined it, but as someone willing to learn from it. When he finally pressed the call button, the action was quiet, almost understated, but the weight behind it was anything but. And as the line connected, Ethan felt something settle within him, not certainty, not resolution, but alignment. As if for the first time in years, his actions were moving in the same direction as his understanding. The phone rang, once, twice, each second stretching slightly longer than usual, not because of impatience, but because of awareness. And when the call was answered, the voice on the other end was calm, familiar, and entirely grounded. "Ethan," Amara said, not surprised, not distant, just present. And for a moment, neither of them spoke beyond that. The silence between them carrying a different weight now, not filled with history, but with possibility. "I wanted to ask if we could meet again," Ethan said, his voice steady, direct, but stripped of any expectation, not assuming agreement, not guiding the outcome, simply expressing intention. And there was a pause on the other end, not long, but deliberate, as if Amara was considering not just the request, but the context behind it, the shift it represented, the intention it carried. "Not at your office," she replied, her tone calm, and Ethan understood immediately, because this was not a conversation that belonged in a space defined by his world, his structure, his control, and he nodded, even though she could not see it. "Of course," he said, his response immediate, without resistance. "There is a small place near the park," she continued. "It is quiet, not crowded. We can talk there." And the simplicity of the suggestion carried with it a subtle shift in balance, because it was not just about location, it was about terms, about stepping into a space that did not belong to him alone, and Ethan accepted that without question. "Tell me when," he replied, and there was a brief pause before she gave a time, not distant, not immediate, but measured, as if allowing space for the moment to settle before it continued. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said, and Ethan nodded again. "I will be there," he answered, and there was no need for further clarification, no need to extend the conversation beyond what had been said, because both of them understood that what mattered was not what was said now, but what would be said next. When the call ended, the silence in the apartment returned, but it did not feel the same. It felt purposeful, as if it was holding space for what was coming. And Ethan set the phone down once more, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed, but grounded in a way that reflected the shift that had taken place. He moved back toward the window, The city still alive beyond the glass, unchanged, consistent. And yet his connection to it felt different now, not diminished, but expanded, as if the life he had built was no longer the only measure of what mattered. And as he stood there, looking out at the lights that once defined his sense of achievement, Ethan Cole understood something with a clarity that did not require confirmation, that the next step he was about to take was not about returning to what he had left behind. It was about moving forward into something he had never allowed himself to see, something that would require patience, presence, and a willingness to become more than what he had once believed was enough. The next day did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with clarity, the kind that does not rush you forward but steadies your steps as you move into something that matters. And as Ethan stepped out of his car near the park, the late afternoon lights stretched across the pavement in long, quiet lines, the air softer than the night before, the city here less demanding, less loud. As if it allowed space for conversations that required something more than speed, the place Amara had chosen was exactly as she described, small, understated, tucked along the edge of the park where the noise of the streets faded into the background and the rhythm of the day slowed just enough to notice. And Ethan paused for a brief moment before stepping inside, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this was not a space he controlled, not a setting designed around him. It was something different, something that required him to meet it as it was. Amara was already there, seated near a window where the light fell naturally across the table, Elijah beside her, his posture calm, his attention focused on something in front of him, a small notebook open, a pencil resting in his hand. And for a second, Ethan stood still, not interrupting, not announcing himself, simply observing the quiet scene, the ease of it, the balance, the sense that this moment existed fully without needing to adjust for his presence. When Amara looked up, her gaze met his with the same steadiness as before, not distant, not welcoming, just present, and she gave a small nod, acknowledging him, and Ethan returned it, stepping forward, taking the seat across from them without unnecessary movement, without filling the space with words before they were needed. "You came," she said, her tone neutral, not surprised, not testing, just stating what was, and Ethan inclined his head slightly. "I said I would," he replied, his voice steady, and there was no need to add more, because the meaning behind that exchange was already understood. This was not about promises, it was about follow-through. Elijah looked up then, his eyes meeting Ethan's with that same quiet awareness, and he offered a small nod, not formal, not hesitant, just acknowledgement, and Ethan returned it, recognizing the simplicity of the moment and the weight it carried, because this was not about introductions anymore. This was about continuation. The server approached briefly, the exchange of simple orders passing without distraction, and when the space settled again, the conversation did not begin immediately. It unfolded, gradually, naturally, as if it had already been in motion long before they arrived. "I thought about what you said," Ethan began, his tone measured, not rehearsed, not structured, just clear, and Amara watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, but attentive, and he continued, "About moving slowly, about doing this the right way." And the words did not come with a plan, not with defined steps, but with intention, and that distinction mattered more than anything he could have outlined. Amara nodded once, acknowledging the statement. "And what does that mean to you?" she asked, her voice calm, and the question was not a challenge. It was an invitation to define something that could not be assumed, and Ethan took a moment, not to construct an answer, but to understand it fully before speaking. "It means I do not expect anything," he said, his voice steady. "Not from you, not from him, not from this." And there was a quiet honesty in that admission that did not seek approval, did not attempt to shape perception. It simply existed as truth, and he continued, "It means I show up, consistently, without trying to control what happens next." And as he spoke, the weight of those words settled into the space between them, not as a promise, but as a direction, a shift in how he approached something that could not be forced. Elijah listened carefully, his attention focused, his expression thoughtful, and after a moment he spoke. "That sounds like building something," he said, his voice soft but certain. And Ethan looked at him, a faint recognition in his expression. "It is," he replied, and for the first time, The word did not refer to business, to structure, to strategy. It referred to something far more personal, something that could not be measured in the same way. Amara observed the exchange, her gaze steady, and there was no immediate reaction, no visible shift, but there was a subtle change in the way she held the moment, not more open, not more closed, just more aware, as if she was seeing something that had not been there before, something that could not be proven through words alone, but would have to be demonstrated over time. Then we start with time, she said finally, her voice calm, and the simplicity of the statement carried everything it needed, because time was not something Ethan could accelerate, not something he could negotiate. It was something he would have to give, consistently, without expectation of return. Ethan nodded, understanding that completely now. Time, he repeated, and the words settled into him with a clarity that felt different from anything he had built before, because it was not about efficiency, it was about presence. The conversation continued in that same steady rhythm, not forced, not structured, but intentional, and with each exchange, the space between them shifted slightly, not closing completely, not resolving everything, but becoming something that could be navigated, something that could hold both the past and the possibility of what might come next. Elijah returned to his notebook briefly, sketching something quietly, his pencil moving in small, deliberate lines, and Ethan found himself watching, not intrusively, but with interest, and after a moment, Elijah turned the notebook slightly, not fully offering it, but not hiding it either, and Ethan saw the outline of a structure, simple, but thoughtful, lines connecting, supporting, forming something stable, and there was something in that image that stayed with him, something that mirrored exactly what this moment required. Amara noticed it too, the small shift in Ethan's attention, the way he observed without taking over, without directing, and she said nothing, because she understood that what mattered now was not what he said, but what he did, consistently, over time. The afternoon light shifted gradually, the sun lowering slightly, casting longer shadows across the table, and as the moment moved forward, it did not rush, it did not demand resolution. It simply existed, grounded, steady, real. And as Ethan sat there, not as the man who controlled every outcome, but as someone willing to step into something uncertain with patience, with presence, with a willingness to earn what could not be given freely, he understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that this was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of something that would be built slowly, deliberately, and that for the first time in his life, that was exactly what it needed to be.